am back today to share a very exciting project. Today, I am going to start making one of my dream dresses. Now, this isn't some elaborate Worth gown or wildly complicated cosplay. This is a very simple dress. I hope it will be simple. Made out of this beautiful black watch flannel that I bought like 3 years ago on impulse. But I'm trying to overcome my fear of actually using fabrics that were really expensive and that have been languishing in my stash for years, and actually putting them to good use. So today we're going to be making this dress. This dress has been in my head for the last 2 or 3 years and has gone through lots of different design phases. I was very heavily inspired by John William Waterhouse's paintings. You probably haven't heard his name, but most likely you'll recognize some of his paintings. I've always really loved the more peasant clothes he drew. He mixes medieval and Renaissance clothing in a very interesting way. Obviously, none of this is historically accurate at all. It was, I think, a Victorian man's interpretation of what people in that period, or in the medieval period, would have worn. But oh my word, the paintings are so lovely, the clothes is beautiful, and some of you might not be aware of this, but a lot of Merida's costuming from the movie Brave are inspired by his paintings. In general, the costuming for the women in that movie were inspired by Pre-Raphaelite paintings.
Hi, this is wrong. Neither J.W. Waterhouse nor John Singer Sargent, whose Lady Macbeth painting you just saw, were part of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. That art movement started a few years before either were born, and the art scene had moved on by the time they were working. The reason Waterhouse is so often lumped in with the Brotherhood is because he purposely emulated their style. Sargent, on the other hand, was more of an impressionist and a formal portraitist. Madame X is probably the painting that most people recognize of his.
Today, I don't know if I've mentioned this already, today is drafting and mock-up day. There'll probably be multiple days, but I'm wanting to draft the front sort of Bertha collar bodice piece. I was hoping I could find a pattern that would be similar enough that I wouldn't have to do this, but I could not find anything.
I found something after the entire project was finished. But if anyone else is interested in making a dress similar to this, I would point you towards this pattern, McCall's M6817, which, surprise surprise, is a Merida costume. This pattern has almost everything I was looking for bodice-wise, and would only have needed a few small adjustments. Had I known this existed, I absolutely would have used this, instead of going through all the trouble of patterning and all the extra mock-ups. Oh well, maybe next time.
So I'm going to see if I can create that. I'm not experienced really at all in pattern drafting, so hopefully it will work. If it doesn't, I do have a pattern to fall back on that is much more reminiscent of the colored design, the front and center one. I think I'll be using part of the bodice in this and modify it just a little bit. This is a McCall's pattern. And yeah, we'll just have to see how it goes. Another thing I need to mock up, or draft and mock up, is the sleeves. I'm much more confident about drafting the sleeves. I'm not kidding myself into thinking it will be easy, but hopefully it won't be too difficult. So, since I'm losing my light pretty badly, I think it's time to go and start working on my mock-ups.
To start the mock-up process, I took a tracing of Simplicity pattern 5637 and sewed that together. That pattern runs really large and the seam placement wasn't exactly right, so I pinned it in and cut where I wanted my new seams to be. Then the muslin was deconstructed, traced, and cut out again. This muslin had a few flaws, like an uneven hem, but it was good enough for me to move forward. Next, it was time for the sleeves. I started with a straight sleeve pattern that I drafted a couple of years ago. I cut one out, wrapped it around my arm, and started making measurements for where I wanted the puffs to go. Then they were marked on the muslin and cut out. I didn't add any seam allowance since this sleeve is ridiculously long.
Okay, so I've been working on this for the better part of a day, and I finally have the bodice all completed and mocked up exactly how I like it, and I have my first mock-up of the sleeve, and it's an okay first attempt. As you can see, it does, like, you know, puff up fairly nicely. I like how it puffs here, but I want more volume here. So next go around, what I'm going to do is try to be very intentional with the gathering and make sure it's not really hardly gathered at all here, and that there's a lot more volume. I also am going to make my strip longer. This is about a 14-inch strip. I think we're going to bring it up to maybe 22 inches. Also, these sections, it's rolled up to get a better idea of the actual, like, where I want it to end. This is way too long, and this is too short. I might actually start the floof here still, but that means that this needs to get be a little bit longer, because it just doesn't hang quite right. I suppose it does bend in sort of the right way, but it's also getting to be in the right area, because if you can see, the weight of the sleeve is pulling it partially off my shoulder, so it's hanging in the correct where I want it. Whereas if I actually was to straighten out the bodice, which it will be better weighted once both of the sleeves are on, then the bend hits, like, my elbows are right here, and the sleeve puff is like up on my arm. So either this needs to get longer and everything gets lowered, or this gets longer. And I don't know, I kind of like it at the length it's at. If it gets too much longer, it's going to get really pancakey, which I don't want. So I think I'm probably going to drop this by an inch, make it an inch or an inch and a half longer, and that should fix the issue. I want my elbow squarely, like, solidly in the middle of the puff, and right now it's right at the edge, like the seam is right there. So also, I don't like how loose fitted it is. I was trying to avoid this because I don't really like puffed sleeves on the shoulder. I think I don't like the look of wide shoulders, and I try to avoid that in my clothing. But it's really hard because my arm size is, you know, a certain size. It's really difficult to, like, get this any more fitted than it already is. So what I think I'm gonna do is just cave and do a really, really tiny puff here that will be pretty ungathered, but just enough to give some give so that I will have, like, the arm mobility that I want, and then I can tighten the band quite a bit here to get, like, the elegant line of the arm that I want. And then I'm also going to tighten this a lot and put buttons along the inner forearm. So a lot to do still with these sleeves, and I'm debating whether or not I want to add box pleat ruffles to the edge of the sleeve, to the cuff as well. So we'll see. I'm not sure if I'm going to do any more tonight. I'm getting kind of tired. But yeah, I will update you soon.
To pattern the upper puff, I traced the sleeve head and cut it into equal sections, then arranged them to give me more fullness at the bottom. For a more detailed explanation of how to do this, check out Carolee Cosplay's puff sleeve video. It was really, really helpful. I'll put a link to it in the annotations in the upper right hand corner.
Alright, so now we have the second iteration of the sleeve, and it's looking a lot better. I didn't originally want to have this puff here because, like I said before, I'm not a huge fan of shoulder puffs because I feel like they greatly widen the shoulders, and I feel like my shoulders are wide enough already. But I think it does a good job of, you know, balancing this lower puff, and people dress the way they dressed in history typically for a reason. There definitely are some things I still need to adjust with this. Both the lower and upper panels have to get shortened because, you know, if you pull this up a little bit, it starts a little less pancakey and a little more, I just think it looks better, and this is just supremely long. I actually think I might be able to get away without putting buttons on this, which I'm going to try to do. I can get my hand through this. It's tight. I have to wiggle it. I don't know if with a fully lined sleeve I will be able to manage that, but we will see. If I have to put buttons on, I have to put buttons on, but I prefer not to because I sew my buttonholes by hand and I just prefer not to do that. So yeah, I wanted to have this all done tonight, but it's late, I'm tired, and I'm gonna pick this up tomorrow. It's tomorrow! And I have finished my mock-up. Look at this beautiful sleeve. I'm so excited. This is my dream sleeve. I don't know, do people really talk about like the dream sleeves? Lots of people like puffy sleeves. Some people like battling sleeves. This is my favorite sleeve, even though I've never had a sleeve like this before. I love it so much. It took so much fiddling, but it was so worth it. I'm covered in orange thread. I ripped these 4 sections out and put them back together so many times, but I have a beautiful double puff sleeve and it's the best thing ever. I have a decent amount of mobility. I can like reach all the way up. Yes, it does sort of warp the bodice out a little bit, but that's okay. You have like fairly tight, nice sort of sausage arm aesthetic while also being able to bend your arm completely. I love this sleeve so much. So now that I've spent probably a good 10 to 12 hours on the mock-up, I can finally start cutting out my fabric. So, this is the fabric of choice. So, this is my lining fabric, and I'm doing some piping that will be done with this, and my main fabric. I'm really excited to finally start, working on the actual dress. I won't start sewing today because cutting is a long and torturous task that completely drains me. I will probably start sewing tomorrow, but I want to get all the cutting done tonight. Am I the only person who, if I have a UFO, it's probably because I cut everything out and then was just so exhausted I didn't continue? Most of my UFOs are in the cutting phase, where all the hard work is done, technically. I mean, it depends on how complicated the project is, but for me, typically the hardest, most procrastinating part of a project is the cutting out of the fabric. Yeah, I've got 2 or 3 UFOs over there in the corner that they're all cut out and ready to be assembled, but I just couldn't and moved on to something else. But that will not be the fate of this dress because it has to go in the capsule in 9 days. So, we're gonna get to cutting.
Even though I was working with a limited amount of fabric, I decided to fussy cut the bodice. I figured I would be unhappy with the final result if I didn't at least attempt to match the plaid. I ended up being able to fussy cut everything except for the upper puff on the left sleeve, so it was definitely worth the effort. I also cut out about 40 yards of bias tape, way more than I needed, for the piping. I decided to do it in the navy instead of the green because I didn't want such a dramatic pop of color. All of the linings got cut out as well, but I did that off camera. The next step I'm not sure was really necessary, but I could tell at the beginning of the project the flannel was the type that was going to grow, so in an attempt to minimize bubbling, I pad stitched all of my linings and bodice pieces before I flatlined them. The reason I don't think this was necessary in the end was the lining and the fashion fabric ended up clinging together really nicely. I don't think it would have moved during sewing. Was it a waste of time? Maybe. But I got to try pad stitching for the first time, and you get this aesthetic imagery, so I think it was worth it in the end. Before I started flatlining, I made the piping, which I only learned after finishing the dress that you aren't supposed to put much tension on. If you pull too hard, you're going to have issues with rippling. Guess what I had issues with? Next, all the bodice and sleeve pieces were flatlined, raw edges serged, and the pad stitches pulled out. With all of the pieces prepared, I could finally start construction. I've never had a project this preparation intensive before. Getting to this point took me 5 days. I wasn't good about filming during the bodice construction, partially because I was starting to get sick of filming, but also because this bodice was a nightmare sent from Hades. I think I took that stupid thing apart 5 or 6 times trying to match the plaid and get the piping right. I've never sewn with piping before, and it ended up being a lot harder than I'd anticipated, especially on curved seams. I also didn't realize that it would somehow eat up my seam allowance, and that I should have added more in the drafting phase. I never did get my plaids quite matched despite my fussy cutting. I realized I'd made a cutting error and that the line down the front panel of the bodice wasn't quite centered. It threw everything off. But with only tiny shreds of fabric left, I had to accept it and move on. I took a break from the very frustrating bodice to work on something I was actually looking forward to, the sleeves. They went together really quickly and easily and set like a dream. All was right with the world. Until it wasn't.
Okay, so last night the bodice was giving me no end of trouble with this attempt to match plaids and whatnot, and it's fitting strangely, so I was like, you know what, let's take a break. Let's assemble something that I actually am looking forward to, the sleeves. So I went and I assembled the sleeves, took like 2+ hours working on the sleeves, and I finished, and I was feeling good. It was like 4 a.m, but you know, day's work well done. And then to my horror, I realized I meant to put piping on it. So now, I have to completely, and I mean completely, except for this top bit, disassemble my sleeves and put them back together again. At least I know how to do it.
So in a colossal grump, I went to bed, and then got up the next day in a much better mood, ready to rip apart my sleeves and make them better. I'd also run out of piping, so I whipped up a few yards of that at the same time. Still pulling on it, mind you.
Okay, the bodice is finished. The sleeves are all on, the piping is done, and I think it came out really beautifully. It was so much extra work to completely unpick and re-sew everything, but I'm really glad I did. It came out super nice. So yeah, other than like eventually evening up and cutting the bodice a little shorter, which I'm super scared to do. Whoops, kicked the tripod. That's all I have left to do for the bodice. The bodice is, other than that, completely done. Next, I am working on the skirt. The skirt I'm hoping will be pretty simple. I haven't quite decided my method of gathering yet, if it's just going to be a regular gather with, you know, running stitches. Originally, I was going to try my hand at cartridge pleating, but I don't think there's going to be enough fullness in the skirt for that. So it'll probably just be regular gathering, and then I have pockets to install as well. So hopefully this will be done in a couple of hours, and then I can start assembling the actual dress. I was originally going to put, for the closure, I was originally going to do buttons, but the bodice is so tight, I'm a little bit afraid that I'm not going to be able to do the buttons up myself. So as much as I try to avoid zippers, I think I might have to make a trip out to Joann's to buy a zipper. I haven't quite decided yet, but I'm leaning more and more towards putting a zipper in just for ease of removability. We'll see.
Before I could move on to the skirt, I had to finish the bodice. A terrifying process because I had to cut it down. When I was making the mock-up, I patterned the bodice too short, so I overcompensated by cutting each piece 2 inches longer. That ended up being way too long. So stip go the scissors on this bodice that has taken a week of work, and with no extra fabric if I make a mistake. No pressure, none at all. I marked my cutting line by putting the bodice on inside out and drafting my mom to mark the waistline in Sharpie. It ended up curved, but it looks straight on my body. Well, for the most part anyway. I cut a little below the line so I could fold the fabric up to finish the edge. I got a little ahead of myself with the pinning though. First, I needed to iron open my seams and whip stitch them to the lining, which took several small eternities. After that, I could finally turn up the hem and finish the bottom edge and the sleeve cuffs, which I did a week and a half later, because I took a break for New Year's. It wasn't because I threw it on my bedroom floor unable to look at it anymore. It was definitely because of New Year's. Anyway. Next it was time for the skirt. First I had to install the pockets. They were cut out, set, and the skirt seamed up. I did set the pockets slightly too low. Normally I have a habit of setting my pockets way too high, and they kind of are uncomfortable to use. This time, they're closer to the hem than they are to the waist, but they're still at least accessible. Everyone has that thing with sewing that they just absolutely hate doing, whether it's sleeves or zippers or buttonholes. It's pockets for me. I absolutely hate them. They're not that hard, but I just find them so tedious and fiddly, and even if I want pockets in my garment, I can't tell you how many times I've just been like, I've lived most of my life without them. I can get by. I just hate them so much. After the pockets were in, it was time to gather the skirt. I ran 2 lines of stitching through the top and carefully gathered the fabric down. Then disaster struck. Again.
So, I was just finishing the gathering when I realized once again that I am an idiot. Because this dress closes in the back, and this skirt is only seamed up the sides, and because this is going to be sitting so high on the waist, there's no way I'll be able to get into this dress without having the seam go partway down into the skirt, or having the closure go partway down into the skirt. So that means I'm going to have to completely ungather, cut the skirt, and make a seam, or I don't know, create a placket thing. I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet. On the bright side, I think I can cartridge plate this. It ended up being full enough. Like, this doesn't, I have this gathered as densely as it can gather, and it still doesn't reach but the measurement I need it to be. So once again, this was a waste, but it wasn't a huge amount of effort. But I need to do a scary thing and cut the skirt, and I need to cartridge plate this, I guess. So I'm going to learn a new skill.
Okay, maybe not a disaster, but it was enough to make me go to bed. After I pulled all the gathering stitches out. I spent a good chunk of the next day sewing 2 lines of running stitches for the cartridge pleats. Yet another thing I've never done before. But it was one of the most relaxing parts of the project. And that tug at the end when you're finally finished, there is no feeling quite like it. It was finally time to sew the bottom and the top of the dress together. This was done by catching each of the pleats' peaks and sewing it down to the bodice. I sewed all the way around the bodice, both at the top of the pleat, where the serging is, and at the bottom of the pleat, where the bodice ends. About 24 episodes of Hunter x Hunter later, and the dress was wearable! Now on to the closure. I kind of don't understand why so many people are intimidated by zippers. I mean, I know that there are a lot of really fiddly methods, and if you've learned a tricky method, then they can be really difficult. But if the method you're using is hard, why not Google an alternative method? There are alternative ways to do almost everything in this life. You just have to find one that fits you best. This is the only method I've ever used, and from what I've seen of other alternatives, I think this is the easiest one, if not necessarily the most pretty. Here's how I do it. To install the zipper, I started with a closed seam. I lined the zipper up face down against the seam and secured it with tape and pins. Then I carefully sewed around it. Rip the seam open, and it's done. The final step has arrived. The hem was folded up 1.5 inches because I like my hems chonky, and whipped down with large stitches. And with that, the dress is finally complete. The time from first mock-up to final hemming stitch was a month, almost to the day. But it spent a collective 2-ish weeks on my floor and floating around my room, so if I'd been pushing harder, it definitely would have been done a lot faster. It has quite a few flaws, several of which I've already mentioned, like the off-center plaid and the rippling piping. There's a bit of bulging in the side seams that I was hoping would get pulled out by the weight of the skirt. It was partially, but not completely. So, I used some unconventional weights in the footage you're seeing here to get a smoother effect. Next time I make this dress, I'm going to cut the bodice even higher, and that should fix the issue. There's also a little bit of bubbling in the front panel, and a bit of loose fabric at the neckline. That was a flaw in the original pattern that I traced that got carried over to this dress. Though it's much less pronounced in my dress, thank goodness. And if I push my shoulders back just right, it smooths out. It encourages good posture. Boat necks are one of my favorite necklines, and I really want to figure out how to get them to lay completely flat. The sleeves and the skirt are my favorite parts of this dress. The piping really brings the sleeves to life. It was so worth redoing them. I need 10 more dresses with sleeves like this. I also really love the look of the cartridge pleats. They give shape and volume to a fabric that would have been pretty limp otherwise. It's definitely a technique I want to repeat in the future. I learned so much in the making of this dress. I make it a point to try a new technique every large project that I take on, but this project was excessive. It was my first time making and sewing piping, first time making puff sleeves, first time cartridge pleating, first time pad stitching, and this is just generally the most complex garment I've ever made without a pattern. Even though it does have a lot of flaws, I'm really proud of my work, and I can't wait until there are places to go again so I can wear it out. Before I go, I have a question for you. What time period does this dress remind you of the most? As I said in the beginning, the sleeves and just the general idea of the dress were inspired by Waterhouse paintings, so roughly medievally / Renaissance-ish. But when I was patterning the bodice, I was trying to channel Jane Eyre, so roughly 1840s. But now as I'm watching the footage, I'm also getting Anne of Green Gables vibes, so I don't know. Maybe I should just call it what it is. Pure fantasy with a little bit of history thrown in to make it interesting. What do you think?